March 22nd, 1943, Western Desert near Mareth Line, Tunisia. The wind had died after midnight, leaving only the rustle of canvas and the faint hiss of sand slipping over metal. Inside a tattered Panzer III, Lieutenant Carl Fischer sat motionless, his hands still on the cold grips of the periscope. The Afrika Korps had fought for months without water, without fuel, and now without hope. The sky to the east glowed faintly orange British flares. From beyond the dunes came the low, steady rumble of approaching Matildas and Crusaders. The once proud 15th Panzer Division was cornered, its men exhausted, starved, their uniforms stained with dust and defeat. At dawn, the white flags began to rise. Fischer stepped out with trembling hands, expecting shouting rifle butts, maybe the end. Instead, the British corporal who met him simply said, "You'll be all right, Jerry. The war's over for you." Fischer didn't believe him. He couldn't. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of British cruelty, of concentration camps in the colonies, of starvation and humiliation. But when the trucks arrived to take them away, not to a firing line, but to a ship bound for Egypt, the fear only deepened. Something wasn't right. The convoy moved east under a sun that seemed intent on burning the world clean. British soldiers sat on the edges of their trucks, rifles slung carelessly, while their prisoners, hundreds of dust-caked Germans and Italians, sat silently in the back, staring out at the endless ochre horizon. Lieutenant Carl Fischer couldn't tell if it was relief or dread sitting in his chest. He had surrendered expecting violence. Instead, he had been given a tin of water and half a biscuit by a British private, who smiled awkwardly as if embarrassed by victory. The man even offered him a cigarette before climbing into the next truck. No one had spoken much since. The desert blurred by in waves of heat, and the line of trucks crawled towards Sfax, where ships waited to take them across the Mediterranean. Fischer tried to imagine what awaited him in captivity. He pictured barbed wire, filthy tents, beatings and interrogations. It was what they were told to expect, that the British treated prisoners like animals. Yet the faces around him didn't match that picture. When they arrived at Alexandria 2 days later, the smell of salt and diesel filled the air. The prisoners were unloaded onto a dock alive with movement, Royal Navy men shouting orders, Egyptian dock workers hauling crates, Red Cross nurses carrying trays of something that looked like tea. Fischer blinked in disbelief. There was no jeering, no rifle butts, only organization. "Line up, name, rank, unit," a British sergeant barked. His tone was clipped but not cruel. When Fischer gave his details, the sergeant nodded and pointed toward a tent where 2 men in khaki medical uniforms waited with clipboards. "You'll get checked, then issued clean clothes. Move along." Clean clothes, Fischer thought it a trick, but then came soap, a shower tent, and even a shave. For the first time in months, he saw his own face in a piece of polished metal. He hardly recognized the man staring back, hollow cheeks, cracked lip, soldier, reduced to bone and dust. The next morning, a train carried them south through the Nile Delta. Palm groves replaced dunes. Children waved as the train passed, shouting words in Arabic Fischer didn't understand. And then, after hours of clattering rails, they reached the camp, Geneifa. It looked nothing like a prison. Rows of whitewashed huts stretched toward the shimmering lake. There were fences, yes, but they were low, almost symbolic. British guards lounged in the shade, their rifles resting idly against sandbags. And above the main gate hung a wooden sign, Geneifa, Prisoner of War Camp. British Army. When Fischer stepped through the gate, he expected the illusion to shatter. But it didn't. Inside, prisoners were playing soccer, real soccer, on a proper field with chalked lines. Others sat on benches under awnings, smoking or reading. A small group tuned instruments near a wooden stage. The sound of a violin drifted through the air. Fisher turned to the guard escorting them. "What is this place?" he asked, in halting English. The guard shrugged. "You're home till the war's over, mate." Inside the barracks, Fisher found rows of clean beds, not cots, but actual bunks with white sheets. On each was a folded towel and a small packet of cigarettes labelled Player's Navy Cut. In the corner, a notice board listed the day's meals and scheduled recreation times. The first night, after eating stew and bread that tasted impossibly good, after months of ration tins, Fisher lay awake listening to the distant music. Someone was playing Lily Marlene on an accordion, and the British guards didn't stop them. In that moment, confusion set in deeper than fear ever had. Were these the same British they had fought at El Alamein, who shelled their convoys and strafed their supply lines without mercy? How could the same enemy treat them with such civility? By the second week, routines emerged. Prisoners attended English classes or joined sports leagues. Fisher was assigned to a small work detail maintaining irrigation channels near the camp perimeter. The guards even chatted with them about football, the weather, or home. And when a new shipment of captured men arrived, gaunt survivors from Rommel's retreat, they too stepped into the sunlight, stunned, blinking, whispering. The same disbelief, this can't be real. Geneifa was a contradiction made of sand and kindness, a place where war's cruelty seemed to stop at the gate. Yet beneath the calm, something unspoken simmered in every German mind. Why would the British build comfort in captivity while the world burned outside the fences? The answer, Fisher would discover, had less to do with mercy and more with control. The mornings in Geneifa began with a whistle, not of alarm, but of order. At 6:00 a.m., the camp stirred to life. Sunlight poured across the rows of huts, glinting off tin roofs and the shimmer of Lake Timza beyond the fences. The prisoners lined up for roll call, the sound of their boots and sandals crunching against the packed earth in rhythm. There was no shouting, no barked insults. The British officers moved among them like overseers of an estate, not jailers. Lieutenant Carl Fisher had begun to see the camp for what it was, a system of quiet power. Comfort, he realized, was not mercy. It was management. Every inch of Geneifa was designed to dismantle the soldier's instinct for resistance. The beds, the cigarettes, the soccer fields, all were tools subtle as propaganda and twice as effective. After breakfast, a meal of porridge, jam and black tea, Fisher and his section were escorted to the work area near the canal. There they dug shallow irrigation trenches under a sky so bright it bleached the horizon. British guards watched from the shade, chatting idly. Occasionally one of them would toss a tin of lemonade or a copy of the Egyptian Gazette toward the prisoners with a grin. The effect was disarming. No German had ever expected to see the word please from a captor, nor to hear, "Take a break, mate, it's bloody hot today." But beneath that civility, the British psychological officers were watching too, not with rifles, but with notebooks. Fisher first noticed them one afternoon near the recreation field, men in khaki shorts and sunglasses talking to groups of prisoners in fluent German. They weren't interrogators, they were listeners. Their mission wasn't to extract secrets by fear, but by comfort. Through organized debates, discussion clubs and lectures, the British sought to measure loyalty, ideology and morale. Captured officers were invited to speak about tactics or the future of Germany, often unaware that their every word was noted by intelligence staff posing as camp officials. The illusion of freedom was part of the experiment. Some camps, like Geneifa, were run under a new British doctrine, re-education through exposure. By allowing Axis prisoners to experience decency, discipline, and limited self-governance, the British hoped to erode their allegiance to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Fischer could feel it working not through conversion, but through doubt. He had joined the Wehrmacht believing the Reich's version of the British arrogant, imperial cruel. Yet the men guarding him here were polite, sometimes even kind. They joked about London fog and tea rations about missing home. Their humanity was a weapon more subtle than any bayonet. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, Fischer overheard a conversation between a British officer and an Egyptian translator. "They're calmer when they think they're respected," the officer said. "Give them a bit of normal life, they stop thinking about escape. They even start talking." Fischer turned away before they noticed he'd heard, but the words echoed in his mind long after. That evening he joined a group of prisoners playing chess under an oil lamp. A British sergeant named Miller watched nearby, smoking. "You play well, Lieutenant," he said when Fischer won a match. "You could teach me sometime." It was the strangest offer Fischer had ever received, one that blurred the line between enemy and acquaintance. Over the weeks, friendships, or something resembling them, began to form. The British Guards lent novels, shared photographs of their families, and occasionally joined the prisoners for football matches. The Germans, in turn, built a small orchestra performing on Sunday evenings. Even the officers attended, listening to Strauss waltzes and Beethoven symphonies under the desert stars. It was, Fischer thought, like living inside a mirage of civilization while the real world outside dissolved into chaos. But for every note of music there was silence about home. Letters arrived rarely censored and delayed. News of Germany came filtered through British bulletins, each framed to remind the prisoners of the Reich's decline. Stalingrad lost U-boats, sunk, Hamburg bombed. And slowly despair seeped in where fear had once ruled. Fischer began to understand the camp's greatest weapon wasn't punishment, it was hope, rationed out just enough to keep men docile, reflective, broken. He wasn't alone in this realization. Oberfeldwebel Hansmeyer, a wiry veteran from Tobruk, confided one night, "They treat us like guests, so we forget we're prisoners. That's worse than any whip. They want us to stop believing in Germany." Fischer didn't answer. The music from the canteen carried faintly on the night wind, violins, soft laughter, the illusion of peace. But behind the laughter, behind the white fences, the desert whispered what the British never said aloud. This comfort was designed not to heal the soldier, but to erase the idea of the enemy. By the autumn of 1943, Geneifa had changed. The heat was still merciless, the sand still invaded everything, but the rhythm of captivity had become almost domestic. Lieutenant Karl Fischer now kept a routine that resembled life more than imprisonment. Mornings began with tea and bread, afternoons with work details or lectures, evenings with games, or the faint hum of music drifting from the recreation hall. The British had even allowed prisoners to form small councils to organize daily affairs. They called it self-administration, but everyone knew the guards still decided everything that mattered. Fischer had become a reluctant member of this council. His English was good enough, and his manners were better than most. It gave him access to the British liaison officers, a strange privilege that felt both empowering and dangerous. One day, Captain Richard Allen, the camp's education officer, invited Fischer for a walk beyond the main compound. It wasn't far, just a stretch along the lake guarded at a polite distance by two soldiers. The wind carried the scent of water and salt. "You know," Allen said, lighting a cigarette, "this camp is quite unique. We believe a man treated well becomes a better man, a better German when the war ends. Fisher frowned. A better German, for whom Alan smiled faintly. For peace. For Europe. You see, this war isn't just about land or oil. It's about what kind of people will rebuild the world afterward. It was propaganda, but softly spoken, not forced into him, just dropped like a seed. Fisher didn't reply. He knew better than to argue, but as they walked, he couldn't help noticing the quiet beauty of the place. The reeds shimmered in the wind. The British guards laughed among themselves. In the distance, Egyptian fishermen cast nets from wooden boats. It was hard to remember that a few months ago he had been inside a tank trying to kill these same men. At night, he dreamt of that contrast, the thunder of battle and the calm of Geneifa. He often woke confused, unsure which version of reality was more real. For many, the camp became a world of its own. Prisoners planted gardens, built furniture, even started small art exhibitions. A few officers wrote plays that were performed in the canteen with costumes sewn from British surplus fabric. The guards applauded politely. It was absurd surreal, like watching civilization rehearse itself in exile. And yet, not everyone accepted this peace. Hans Meyer, the same wiry veteran from Tobruk, refused to join the activities. "You don't see it, Karl," he said bitterly. "They're turning us into pets, feeding us, entertaining us so we forget who we are," Fisher argued back. "Would you prefer starvation?" Beating's Meyer's eyes flashed. "I'd prefer truth, not this dream." That night, Meyer tore down a British notice board filled with camp announcements. The guards didn't punish him. They simply replaced it the next morning. The silence of their restraint was worse than any cell. Over time, resistance gave way to fatigue. Prisoners stopped arguing politics. They read English novels, practiced cricket, discussed Shakespeare with British officers. A few even volunteered to help in the infirmary or the kitchen, grateful for small privileges. And then came the letters. Each week, Red Cross trucks delivered sacks of mail, thin envelopes, opened and resealed, but precious beyond measure. Some carried photographs, others only silence. Fisher's first letter came in November. "Karl, we are alive. Hamburg is no more. Father gone. Be safe." He read it under the dim lamplight and felt the world outside collapse. While he lay in a clean bed under a painted ceiling, his city had been reduced to ashes. The next day, when Captain Allen greeted him with his usual calm smile, Fisher barely nodded. That evening he skipped the orchestra. The music now sounded obscene. He began to notice small cracks in the camp's facade. The British didn't allow prisoners to speak freely about the war. Radios were banned except for one controlled broadcast of BBC News. When the Allies advanced in Italy, the announcements were made cheerfully. When German forces resisted, the reports were brief, dismissive. The guards no longer shared cigarettes as easily. And then there were the interrogations, quiet, polite, but unmistakable. The British intelligence men had returned, dressed like civilians, asking questions masked as conversation. They wanted to know which officers had been loyal to the party, who had served in the SS, who could be trusted for post-war reconstruction. Fisher answered carefully, aware that each sentence could echo far beyond the camp walls. He realized then that Geneifa wasn't just a prison, it was a mirror, a place where men saw what they wanted to believe about their enemies and about themselves. And as the mirage deepened, so did the question haunting every German prisoner. Were they still soldiers of a defeated army or guests in the Empire's quiet laboratory of conscience? By early 1944, the war beyond Geneifa had turned into rumor. The desert winds brought no gunfire, only whispers carried by new prisoners. Gaunt men from Italy, hollow-eyed, Luftwaffe crews shot down over the Mediterranean, and once a U-boat survivor who spoke of entire convoys burning on the Atlantic. Lieutenant Karl Fischer listened in silence as they recounted how the Reich was shrinking. Rome was falling, Hamburg was ash, Berlin was trembling under Allied bombs, each story chipped away at the last remnants of certainty that had once kept his spine straight. Inside the camp, life went on. The orchestra still played the soccer matches, still drew laughter, and British guards still saluted politely. But beneath the civility, an invisible shift was happening, one that changed the very nature of captivity. The British, ever pragmatic, began allowing select prisoners to work outside the wire. Not as slaves, but as labourers under supervision. Fischer was among the chosen. He joined a team assigned to maintain the nearby water purification plant, a complex of pipes and tanks shimmering like a mirage under the Egyptian sun. The work was light, but the freedom was heavier than he expected. The men moved under watch, yet the line between guard and worker had blurred. One corporal even shared his lunch hard cheese tomatoes and a small square of chocolate. It was the first taste of sweetness Fischer had known in years. He began to feel something he hadn't felt since before the war normalcy. Each evening when they returned to Geneifa, the camp gates closed behind them with a metallic clang that no longer sounded cruel but necessary, as if the outside world were more dangerous than within. Letters continued to arrive, each one a lifeline and a wound. Fischer's mother wrote of shortages of cold winters, of the silence in Hamburg, where houses once stood. "Your brother is missing near Kiev," she wrote. "We pray you are safe, even if it is among the enemy." He stared at the page until the words blurred. Safe among the enemy. The thought was unbearable, and yet true. That night, as desert winds swept through the barracks, Fischer lay awake listening to the murmurs of men dreaming out loud. Some dreamed of homecomings, others of nothing at all. The camp had become a strange nation, one of ghosts' memories and borrowed civility. Not all accepted it quietly. Hans Meyer, still defiant, had joined a small circle of men who secretly carved news clippings into pieces of wood maps of lost battles, copied from smuggled newspapers. They met in the laundry hut at night, whispering about Germany's coming revenge, even as reality made that impossible. Fischer admired their courage, but pitied their blindness. "You can't fight a war from behind a fence," he told Meyer. Meyer's reply was sharp. "Then why do you polish your boots every morning? Because you still believe you're a soldier too." He was right. Discipline was the only thing Fischer had left. Without it, he feared he'd dissolve into the softness the British had built for them, a world too clean, too quiet to belong to war. That fear deepened when an unexpected visitor arrived, a British journalist with a camera and notebook. The camp, he said, was a model of humanitarian treatment. He photographed smiling prisoners playing chess, British guards shaking hands with Germans, and the orchestra performing Blue Danube. "Show the world," the journalist said, "that the British Empire treats its enemies with dignity." The images would later appear in London papers, framed as moral victory proof that the Allies fought not just with bombs but with conscience. None of the photographs showed the faces that stared blankly between smiles, the men who no longer knew whether to be grateful or ashamed. Weeks later, when the Red Cross inspectors visited Fischer, overheard one of them mutter, "It's remarkable, they're healthier than some civilians in Europe." The British officer beside him nodded proudly. "We believe the mind is best disarmed when the body is at ease." That line struck Fischer harder than any shell had ever done. That night he walked to the fence and looked out over the desert, endless, indifferent, ancient. He thought of the men still fighting in Italy, the burned cities, the sea of graves. And here he was alive, well fed, his body rested, his soul suspended. Was this mercy or a slow erasure of everything that had once made him a soldier? The orchestra played again in the distance, the same waltz, the same applause. But in Fisher's mind, the notes bent and cracked, twisting into the sound of wind over empty dunes. The war had left him, but it had not released him. By the summer of 1945, Geneifa stood in a strange twilight between war and peace. The guards no longer shouted orders, they gave updates. The guns had fallen silent in Europe, yet the desert remained timeless, sun, wind and sand erasing the urgency that once defined the world. Lieutenant Carl Fischer read the news, slowly tracing the words as though they were wounds. Berlin has fallen, Hitler is dead, Germany surrenders unconditionally. Each headline felt less like an ending than a confession, the end of belief, not just the war. Around the camp, the prisoners moved like ghosts. No one celebrated, no one cursed. They had spent 2 years learning to live like civilized captives, and now they were told they were free to return to a country that no longer existed. When Captain Allen made the announcement, his voice carried a tone of genuine regret. "Gentlemen, your war is over. Transport arrangements will begin soon. Until then, we ask for your patience." Patience, the one virtue the British had perfected, and the Germans had learned the hard way. In the following weeks, the camp began to dissolve piece by piece. Soccer goals were dismantled, notice boards stripped of their timetables. The orchestra played its last concert beneath the open sky, a strange blend of British marches and German waltzes. The guards applauded softly, almost reverently, as though bidding farewell to an era neither side fully understood. Fisher stood apart, watching the sunset turn the lake into molten copper. He thought of his brother missing in the east, of Hamburg reduced to rubble, of his mother writing letters into silence. He felt neither victory nor defeat, only an ache for meaning. When the first trucks arrived to take them north toward Alexandria, Fisher found himself among the first group to leave. His British escort, Sergeant Miller, the same man who had once played chess with him, handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of the camp orchestra and a note that read, "Not all wars are fought with guns." "Take care, mate." Fisher folded the note without a word. The journey north was long and quiet. The trucks rolled past date palms and ruined depots, through villages where children waved, not knowing these dusty men had once been their enemy. For the first time, Fisher saw British and German soldiers sitting side by side, talking not about battles, but about home, Manchester, Dresden, Cairo, Kiel. The accents blurred. The uniforms no longer mattered. At the docks, the Red Cross supervised the embarkation. Each man received new clothes, a ration pack, and a paper-stamped repatriation. Geneva Convention. The British officers saluted them as they boarded. No hatred, no triumph, only fatigue. As the ship pulled away from the harbour, Fisher looked back toward the Egyptian shore. The camp, the desert, the illusion all fading into the horizon. He realized how profoundly it had changed him. He had entered Geneifa as an enemy soldier, ready for humiliation or death. He left as something else, not loyal to the Reich, not grateful to the British, but aware of a truth no propaganda had ever taught him, that mercy, when used with precision, could rewrite a man's soul more deeply than cruelty ever could. Weeks later, when Fisher finally reached a shattered port in southern France, the war's reality hit him full force. The train stations were ruins, the faces hollow. The homeland he had imagined no longer matched the one that received him. He passed through what remained of Hamburg months later, streets, unrecognizable rivers, choked with debris, silence where laughter once lived. Nobody cared about the desert or Geneifa or the British orchestras. There were no camps here, no tea, no smiles, only hunger and ash. Standing amid the rubble, Fisher felt a paradox that would haunt him forever, that his captors had preserved his humanity better than his own country could. Years later, when he tried to explain Geneifa to others, few believed him. They imagined cages and cruelty, not soccer fields and kindness, but for those who had lived it, the memory was sharper than any blade, a reminder that even in the heart of war, men could be both prisoner and free enemy and mirror. As an old man, Fisher would tell his grandson one final truth. The British didn't win my loyalty in Egypt. They won something rarer. They made me question who I was fighting for. And when the boy asked if he hated them, Fisher smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I just never stopped wondering which side truly understood what victory meant." The desert wind, eternal and indifferent, carried no answer.